It is one of the great gifts of my job, of this work, is being able to sit with folks and just be a presence, be a listening ear, be a shoulder at times, to hear these stories of triumph, these stories of pain and suffering, stories of loss, stories of wins, so many stories. It truly is a gift to me. And then there are the times when I hear the story again and again, and that very same story again, and then another time, and so many stories on repeat. Stories of victimization, stories of I am not enough, stories of everybody hates me and I'm gonna go eat worms. I mean, the stories on repeat sometimes, y'all. We have another option. We have an option to view our mind as a house, Fred Luskin says, author. He says, it can teach you to control how much space you rent to your wounds and grievances. You are the proprietor, and you set the rent. How much space in your house are you giving to your wounds, to your grievances, to your complaints, to your woe? How much? Think about it. Take a minute. If you had to divide the mind into a house, how many rooms have you rented out to stories of woe? Whether you tell those stories out loud or you just tell them over and over and over again in your own mind. Here's the good news, though, as Mr. Luskin tells us. You are the proprietor. You get to decide who gets to rent from you and how much you want to charge. Is it worth telling that story over and over and over again? Or, as the amazing Aaron and Jazz Coffee shared with us, can we get really intentional about the stories we're telling? Can we understand that we are the authors of our lives and be so emboldened by the fact that God is living itself as you, as me, and that we can take that divine authority and write a new story?
People are inspired by stories, by seeing what's going on in the world, how it affects them, and that prompts something in them to be inspired toward an action, right? Whether it's a community-oriented or, right? We're all inspired by a story or a story that was told to us. For me, as a poet, as someone who considers herself an activist, it was poetry for me that sparked that passion in me for a pursuit of justice or community impact, right? I was doing poetry at a time where not a lot of young people were doing poetry. I was 16 years old. I didn't know that there was other young people in Albuquerque doing poetry. You know, all the people who had pointed me to this event were adults, family, friends. And afterwards, after the whole event concluded, Shell approached me. She told me about a program that was taking place that summer, which happened to be the summer I dropped out of high school. So it kind of fit perfectly. But during my time in that program, which I attended for 3 years and came back as a student mentor, right? I was exposed to artists, poets, writers in my community, and saw a whole nother aspect of Albuquerque, New Mexico, what it means to be a young Black person in Albuquerque, New Mexico, also a Black biracial, multiracial, however you want to say it, child, and finding my voice. That really for me was my first sort of awakening to what is the storytelling thing? Do I have stories to tell? What are the stories that I will tell? And how do I kind of take those stories in, and how do they affect me? How do they move me or inspire me to these different things, or open my eyes to worlds I didn't even know existed, or issues that I never could maybe put a name on, but now there's a name to it, and it gets you thinking about, well, how can I say what I need to say in a way that somebody's going to listen and be moved and be inspired maybe to do something. I guess activism and storytelling, when they are bound up together, they all paint a story of some pursuit of justice. I think you have to have a deep sense of personal justice or idea of justice and how you work in the world before you're able to say anything about anybody else, right? Sometimes people do. Sometimes it is performative, right? Power to the people is a performative thing, religious dress, whatever, and people use that as their right to do whatever, right? Or say whatever. What story are you telling? Are you telling yourself that you just have to do this much and it's okay, and I just got to look out for myself, and as long as I get through? Sometimes you do. Self-preservation, you just look out for yourself, right? But also, what is the service to others? And are you doing it from a real place?
Spirituality, activism, pursuits of justice, any of the above can often be co-opted as or degraded to being performative. That they really only exist within the hands of certain people as something that they can demonstrate to others, not that it's something that they've internalized or used to shape the life or the world they're trying to live in.
Because oftentimes I think spirituality, when you can take it to extremes or anything like that, is used to justify certain things, or certain spiritual people or people who claim spirituality use it to bypass the things that they are not working on, right? Like, just because I go to church or because I gather some crystals and I said my mantra for today, I'm clear, right? I'm clear. And when they're not really looking at how are their daily actions, who they are in the world, affecting other people, how are they impacting their immediate environment to their broader community, I guess.
It's really easy to say someone who is being explicitly and clearly harmed or mistreated deserves justice, and to think that they should be elevated to your personal level, that they deserve exactly what you're getting. It's harder to recognize that maybe you are getting more than is right or than you deserve, and that actual justice would mean equalizing back to a level that is sustainable for all people.
I think that's true, because oftentimes people think of justice as black or white, right? It's either wrong or it's right, it's good or it's bad, it's you did this and now you deserve to, not have anything, or, and it's about, it really is about how do you make that exception, because and nobody ever wants to give anybody exceptions, right? Because then that's not fair. But I think it's fair to give exceptions because it isn't black and white, and sometimes you have to give exceptions to certain people, groups, whatever, because of circumstances. All of our circumstances are not the same. We don't all come from the same background. We don't all have the same family makeup. We may have not had the experiences to kind of broaden our minds in certain ways, or have those conversations where we can be super academic about it and know all these awesome words because we went to an anti-oppression training or did, you know what I mean?
But stories, communication, self-expression are the things that bridge those gaps. In lots of instances, that's, infinitesimal. I think we see that in modern society in YouTube videos, in TikTok, in blog posts, those small activities, whether you're thinking of something positive or negative, but those small things, these little bites of data, end up bringing communication and a story to a massive amount of the population that, in the idealistic sense, unites them around the idea of making positive change, of doing something about it or feeling differently about the world that they thought they understood before getting that type of story. And I think in a modern sense, that's the easiest way to look at it. But I think if you follow that thread all the way back to oral story traditions and the first written words, the same applies. And that's been the nature of what has been attempted by the first people who did cave paintings, I would assume. I really can't say what they were attempting to communicate, but definitely within the oral story traditions of indigenous people around the world, in every spiritual tradition that has been textualized, if not started out textually, in trying to communicate a story and a message of justice. Every single one. I don't think that, at least in my estimation from what I've read, seen, or think that I understand, that there is one that doesn't address the concept of justice. Some of them may be very anti-activist. They may say something implicitly of non-interaction, of not interfering with or making the corporeal matter within what you're doing. But even that is usually promulgated as an idea about that will create justice for everyone else. Don't interfere with what everyone else is doing, or bring the word to others so that they can all see justice.
The soul, being the seat of memory, already contains a record of everything that has ever happened to us. These memories as a whole constitute the subjective tendency of the individual life. This tendency can be changed through constant effort. And as I was listening to Jazz and Aaron talk about being storytellers, I was really struck by Jazz's story. And she talked about how, as a 16-year-old girl, being exposed to powerful stories and words opened her up to her own voice, where she began to start telling her own stories and sharing those stories, impacting other lives, so maybe inspiring others to speak truth to power. And it is when we begin to find our voice as divine, unique, perfect emanations of the One, and do the wrestling as she shared with us. What stories should I tell? What stories are important? How can I inspire others? How can I impact justice? And getting super intentional about the stories we tell. The stories we tell ourselves, as she recognized in her own journey. And what does that sound like to you? To me, it sounds like growing consciousness. By allowing our awareness to get greater around what stories we're telling ourselves, telling one another, grows our consciousness and gives us more authority and choice around the stories we tell. Raymond Charles Barker, one of the early folks in the New Thought Christian movement, said, "Check your thinking of even the past hour. It will reveal where you stand in the hallways of mind." So I want you to take a moment right now and think about the last hour. What kind of stories were you telling? How much space in your mind house did you give to wounds and grievances just in the last hour? To complaints? What happens when we, like a young 16-year-old budding poet, decide to get super intentional about the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we put out into the world? We have this opportunity as conscious beings of the divine. We have this opportunity to step further into our greatness, to allow a holy, holy uprising in our own consciousness and in our storytelling, to impact what we are aware of and to begin to impact collectively what is happening. And I loved how Aaron spoke to that justice is inherent for him in storytelling, in his spirituality. Because I will go back to what I spoke to around what Howard Thurman was saying, that the core of all religious understanding and teaching is oneness. Is that there is a oneness that we each belong to. And as Aaron shared with us, and every single aspect of that oneness deserves its just due. And how are the stories you're telling the story of oneness? How are the stories you're telling allowing for the connection and the tapestry of life to receive its just due? Because these are not separate endeavors, spiritual living and justice. Storytelling is not just a creative act in the art world. It is a creative act in life itself. And how are you contributing to the creation, the co-creation of life itself through the stories you are telling? Because we can't tangle that out. It's not like, oh, I'm going to tell a story over here, but it doesn't matter over there. Or I'm going to just tell this story to myself on the inside, but it's not going to impact anything out here. And yes, it does. Yes, it does. Because it's all one. And the willingness to become conscious and aware of the stories we tell, of the space we are giving in our own minds to these stories. It requires a pretty radical honesty with ourselves. It requires a willingness to get so real with ourselves that we then are willing to be transformed with a greater awareness. Because that is the commitment to spiritual living, is a willingness to be transformed, a willingness to be changed through the holy, holy uprising in our own consciousness. And because we do that wrestling, and because we grow our awareness of what's really going on in here and out of my mouth and out of my actions and out of the story I'm living, that begins to transform the collective. Mark Nepo, in 7,000 Ways to Listen, says, in many ways, our stories are part of one story. Our pain is part of one pain. Our surprise at the beauty and fragility of life is part of one chorus of awe. So even in the stories we tell, we cannot escape the oneness. In the fragility that we may experience or we may witness in someone else's lives as part of that glorious whole. And the more conscious we become of that, the more just I believe we will be in our actions. It's all connected. The choices are always entangled in this oneness. So one of the things that you'll have the opportunity to do this week is what Ernest Holmes says, today you are going to take your life in your own hands, realizing God is ever with you. Realizing God is ever with you. Because if we make that real, if we make oneness real, then God is ever with me. God is ever with you. And if you're telling another story, you're telling a lie. So in the practice of oneness, in the living of spiritual principle, in the living of justice, which really is another way of saying oneness, because if we are all one, then of course this oneness should all have their just due. And if we're telling another story, it's time to get honest about it. It's time to wrestle with it. And as Ernest said, it's time to take our lives into our own hands and create with those very hands a story that serves, a story that honors oneness, a story that reflects the truth of who we each are and that life is. And if we are renting out rooms left and right in our own minds to lies, today's the day. Start putting people out, putting stories out. You got to go. You are evicted from here. The price is too high to continue, to resonate, be a radio tower for suffering, for pain, for hurt, for injustice. It's time to tell a new story. It's time to step in and rise up to our holy wholeness, to the truth of who we are, and let that be the story we are authoring in all the unique and beautiful ways that we can tell those stories. And I have an ask. I have an ask of you. So my birthday is coming up. On June 8th, I am turning 49. 49, it's the last of my glorious 40s decade. And the 40s have been so good to me. I can't wait to see what the 50s bring. But before that happens, for my birthday, I want 49 contributions to Love in Action. I want to see 49 financial gifts to the center. And even more than that, I want 49 stories of love in action. 49 stories of the truth of who you are in action. And there's some ways that you can get those stories to me. You can post them to our Facebook group, the ABQ CSL Spirit Asme Forum, and you can email them. And I love pictures and videos, so feel free to go crazy with your creativity in it. You can email me those stories if you're not on Facebook and not in our group. And if you are on Facebook and not in our group, join the group. But you can also email me at revamani@abqcsl.org. My birthday is June 8th. So for the whole month of June, I want to be collecting these stories of love in action and collecting financial gifts and contributions to our mission of love in action. Happy birthday to me, and so it is.
Hello, Reverend Amani Malaika here. Thank you so much for your support of the work we've been doing. Text to Give is a simple way to support what we're doing. transforming lives and communities. Be love in action.